The chair recognizes Mr. James Viola, President and CEO of Helicopter Association International. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Sam Graves, Ranking Member Garrett Graves, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for your leadership and for holding this hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony today. I have been involved in aviation for more than 35 years and began my aviation career in the U.S. Army with the majority of my flying done as a special operations helicopter pilot. I later joined the FAA, where I most recently served as the Director of General Aviation Safety Assurance. I now serve as the President and CEO of Helicopter Association International. Throughout my career, I've been dedicated to safety and the continued development and refinement of safe aviation operations. The unique capabilities of vertical flight means we can accomplish missions that no other aircraft can. And our industry is also expanding, bringing onto the flight deck exciting technologies such as advanced air mobility and eVTOL aircraft. Our operations are conducted at lower altitudes and at lower speeds. Many flights are conducted from start to finish without the use of airports. Every day, vertical flight serves the public good. Our members do everything from air medical, law enforcement, firefighting, heavy construction, urban air mobility, and even more. Helicopter air ambulance operators transport roughly 1,000 injured critically ill patients every day. The FAA, in carrying out its mission to maintain aviation safety, put into place restrictions on helicopter flight operations through NOTAMs and Airworthiness Directives, or ADs, in order to mitigate the risk of 5G interference with aircraft radio altimeters. For helicopters, the AD prohibits certain operations requiring radio altimeters. The restriction in the AD, which prohibits takeoff and landings, has significant far-reaching consequences for the rotorcraft industry. We may be unable to conduct certain missions that provide public services, especially when you consider that limitations applies to nearly 2,000 NOTAM designated locations. To combat the impacts of 5G interference, the FAA implemented an alternative method of compliance, or AMOC. To date, the focus has been on Part 121 air carriers, and the FAA has done tremendous work there, but this is a Band-Aid approach to a permanent problem that is constantly changing. The rotorcraft AMOC procedures have not been formally released by the FAA. The process is still being fine-tuned. We believe it is critical that the FAA continue the same level of urgency and commitment as they have had for the commercial aviation to mitigate operational impacts upon helicopter operations and the essential services they provide to save lives, protect communities, and support jobs. It must be recognized that rotorcraft's operational environment is vastly different than the airlines. Helicopter operations, which take place at much lower altitudes than airline flights, could very well conduct their entire flight within the zones of this interference. Rotorcraft utilize airports as well as unimproved locations such as streets, parking lots, or fields. The other avenue to combat the operational impact of 5G interference is the exemption process. The FAA partially approved a HAI petition for exemption, allowing helicopter air ambulance operators to continue flying with restrictions. This relief will also allow them to use night vision goggles in the helicopter air ambulance operations. 97% of the 1,250 helicopters used in helicopter air ambulance now have a HAI exemption. I want to be very clear. HAI and our members are not against 5G. However, due to our mission profiles and operational parameters, 5G interference is of particular concern to the vertical flight sector. We want to ensure that 5G is deployed in such a way that it can safely coexist with aviation operations. The development of new radio altimeters with filters that can withstand 5G interference will take time, and the cost for operators to purchase and install these new altimeters is of particular concern to the industry. In the short term, HAI is focused on working with the FAA on the AMOC process and additional exemptions with mitigations to allow operators to provide services to their communities. In the long term, we urge Congress to enact reforms to provide better transparency and coordination on the spectrum issues. The Department of Commerce and its Federal Advisory Committee have studied the issues of equitable access to spectrum and identified several recommendations. The reason we are here today is clear. Misaligned spectrum policy has disadvantaged aerospace and aviation users. It is imperative we find a solution to address the currently failed system. so that we are not in the same situation again. I thank the committee again for the opportunity to provide the perspective of the vertical flight industry, and I look forward to continuing our work together in these important issues. My full comments are offered for the record. I welcome any questions.
Congresswoman Holmes Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, my first question is for Mr. Viola, President of the Helicopters Association. I represent the nation's capital, and as you know, the President and Congress are located here. In your testimony, you noted increased risks of 5G interference to helicopters, given that helicopter operations generally take place at much lower altitudes than airline flights, and could conduct their entire flight within zones of 5G interference. The development of new radio altimeters with filters that can withstand 5G interference is therefore critical to helicopter and rotorcraft's safety, but the costs for operators to purchase and install these new altimeters is of significant concern. Could you estimate the cost to helicopter operators to upgrade to newer, more resilient radio altimeters, and how do helicopter operators plan to cover this cost?
So thank you very much, Congresswoman Holmes Norton. I appreciate that question. Helicopters are just so much different from what we've been hearing today as far as when the radar altimeter actually kicks in. You heard a lot about the 121 and airlines, where most of their flight will be without that radar altimeter because it actually turns off once you get so high above the train. The helicopters use a radar altimeter a lot of times for, where it's actually notamed out is because of reduced visibility. So when we have good visibility, the radar altimeter is a safety aspect that gives us additional, not only are our eyes telling us how far we are off the ground, because normally, especially if you're talking about coming in to get the president or yourself or someone flying around the DC area, you're actually deconflicting with the airliners that are over the top of you. You're coming up the river. So over the water, that's where the pilot will glance over to make sure that he's maintaining the proper altitude above the ground. So the importance of that and being able to not be affected by 5G and the filtering, you asked about the cost. I don't actually have the cost for those. And of course, a lot of those aircraft are going to be on the military side too. And I haven't been read into how much work they've been doing with the military aircraft to try to upgrade their radar altimeters.
Could the cost impact the timeline for upgrading rotorcraft fleets?
Well, what our problem right now with the rotorcraft fleet is that the AD, the Airworthiness Directive, and the NOTAMs, we're still having conversations with the FAA to determine what that actually means for the vertical flight community. Because the AD, the Airworthiness Directive, actually says that the radar altimeter is unairworthy, and then the NOTAM area supposedly says those are the areas where it may be unairworthy. And so we still don't have we have no AMOCs yet for the rotorcraft or the vertical flight community, and we're working very close with the FAA to get there. And so we're actually held back by regulations, and a lot of times you'll hear me talk about regulations shouldn't apply to just helicopters. It should be a mission set. And so right now, the FAA has told us helicopters, and that's why we specifically went in and we made sure we got an exemption for the air ambulance mission, because we want to make sure they can deploy. And so what they did for the air ambulance mission is the FAA says, okay, you can fly without the radar altimeter, even though it's required by rule, if you do additional training for all your pilots and you have a movable searchlight. So it's things like that they're trying to come up with that equivalent level of safety. And that's why, until we get AMOCs, we really can't even get a cost estimate.
Thank you. Just a few follow-ups. I want to underscore a point that the chair made about the language being used. Ms. Baker's comments, or his testimony said you state the Radio Technical Commission for Aeronautics, RTCA, study applied flawed methodology and implausible scenarios. The actions of the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS, flaw that overrode pilot auctions in the flight deck of 737 MAXs was an implausible scenario, and yet it did happen. We're in the implausible scenario business, and so that is why there is such a thin safety margin in aviation. That's why we don't, frankly, we take personally, because we take responsibility for aviation safety on the subcommittee when we talk about implausible scenarios, because there really aren't implausible scenarios when it comes to aviation safety. So I just want to underscore that point about that, using that term, because it really sort of tells me that y'all don't really get what we're trying to do. I think that's changed, granted, I think that's changed, but I also think that underscores a foundational problem that got us here in the first place. I mentioned at the beginning about just very different cultures between the industries, different cultures between the agencies involved. So I hope we've made that point strongly. Mr. Viola, on helicopters, given the fact there are currently no AMOCs for helicopters, I mean, just how are, I presume helicopters are flying, but what does your future look like right now?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Chairman Larson. Well, that is kind of the problem we have. We've got some regulatory compliance issues, and because of the ADs and the NOTAMs, there are a lot of aircraft that aren't flying right now. And so we're really working for clarification as to, what are the requirements. If the aircraft is required, or if it's a newer aircraft that has a radar altimeter on it, well, then that's when the AD kicks in on certain types of, you actually need to rewrite what the procedures are that describe when the radar requirement was needed. And then if the aircraft didn't have a radar altimeter and didn't need it, then those aircraft can still fly. So we're still, last night and even this morning before our testimony here, working to see what exactly, if everybody in the FAA can agree to what the AD means for helicopters and what the NOTAM actually means for helicopters. Does it mean a possible interference, or does it mean that you can't fly in that area at all?
Your testimony said there's 55 public use heliports in the country. Is that right? On page 6 of your testimony, 55
Yes.
public use. But that number is dwarfed by anywhere from 6,533 to 8,533 helicopter or ambulance landing sites in the United States. Is that right?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Do you have any indication that any of these numbers were taken into any consideration by the NTIA or the FCC as they looked at these issues?
No, we have
none at all.
no indication that they tried to avoid any of our known heliports. And I think it's kind of the same thing as it is for the airports, where normally, when the risk is introduced to aviation, or there's methods or systems to prevent that risk from being introduced. I think in this case here, the risk is introduced and now we're dealing with it.